Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Chinatown Hall. I know a lot of you who are in attendance tonight, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Philip Stolley, and I'm an associate professor of political science, as well as the endowed professor of environmental diplomacy here at DePaul University at the Gray School for Applied Diplomacy. And I welcome each of you to tonight's event. If I'm not mistaken, this is the 11th Chinatown Hall hosted by DePaul University. And each of these events has been a wonderful opportunity for us to come together as a community to learn and to discuss all things China, Chinese politics, Chinese society, Chinese culture, and its international relations, and particularly its relationship with the United States. And I've participated in each of these events in some form or fashion, but I am particularly excited about tonight's event because we have with us one of, if not the foremost experts in China's climate change policies and its relationship with the United States in the climate arena. With rising temperatures and extreme weather events taking place across the globe, I think climate change is something that has been on all of our minds lately. And this is a very important moment in international climate change politics. Several studies in recent years have made clear that the policies we adopt in the next few years over the next decade are going to go a long way towards determining whether we are able to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And as you may know, starting in a couple of weeks, the nations of the world are going to be gathering together in Glasgow, Scotland, to negotiate an update to the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, the landmark agreement in which over 190 nations agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And at this United Nations conference, all eyes will be on China and the United States, the two leading emitters of greenhouse gases that collectively account for 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So no two countries have more power to shape our climate future than China and the United States, which is why we are very fortunate to have someone with us tonight, Dr. Kelly Sims-Gallagher, who is an expert on this issue. And she will be giving her talk entitled China's Climate Policy in the Context of US-China Relations. Dr. Sims-Gallagher is an academic dean and professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. There she directs the Climate Policy Lab, as well as the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. Her research focuses on energy innovation and climate policy, and she specializes in how policy spurs the diffusion and the development of cleaner energy technologies, both domestically and internationally. She is the author of more titles than I have time to recite, but her most recent book is Titans of the Climate, Explaining Policy Process in the United States and China, which was published by MIT Press in 2018. Also of note to those of you who were here and are associated with the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy, Dr. Sims-Gallagher has served not only at the highest levels of academia, but also in government. During President Barack Obama's second term, she served as a senior policy advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the senior China advisor in the Special Envoy for Climate Change Office of the US State Department. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Sims-Gallagher. Now, just before I turn the floor over to her, let me say a quick word of thanks to the individuals and organizations that helped put on this event tonight, starting with the National Committee on US-China Relations, which organizes the Chinatown Hall each year. As you may have heard if you watch Fareed Zakaria's webinar, this is an event taking place in 88 venues across the United States, Europe, and China. And let me also give a word of thanks to the Chinese Studies program of the Department of Modern Languages, and of course, the tireless efforts of Professor Li Jin, who has done a lot of the work in organizing this, and as well as the aforementioned Gray School of Applied Diplomacy. One last reminder before I turn it over to Dr. Gallagher, this is intended to be a Q&A, so after Dr. Sims-Gallagher makes her remarks, we will have times for questions. So as she is speaking, feel free to take mental note of any questions you want to ask her. You can put them in the chat and I'll do my best to see them and to read them. Afterwards, you can also use the raise hand function in Zoom. We're going to keep you on mute while she is speaking, just so that there's no disturbances and we can all hear clearly. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Gallagher and say thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, great. Thank you for that very generous introduction. It's wonderful to see you, Professor Stolle. It's been a long time. It'd be nice if we could see each other in person, but this is a good substitute. I look forward to discussion tonight, so don't be shy to put questions in the chat and to raise your hand, and I'd like to be as interactive as possible. But let me just put a few thoughts on the table, and I think we saw this topic already came up in the Q&A in the main China Town Hall with Fareed Zakaria. Let me start by saying that the US and China have many shared challenges as they relate to climate change mitigation. Both countries rely heavily on coal still today. Both countries have very large economies that rely heavily on their energy systems. Of course, our populations are quite different, but still, we both have large populations as well. And although our political systems really, in a way, could not be more difficult, more different, in some ways, we share some of the same political challenges as it relates to climate action. And I think as a result of all of these shared challenges, we've seen that both countries have a tendency to defer action. And yet our long-term success in addressing the climate challenge depends very much on early action. To give you an example, both countries would benefit enormously from passing national climate legislation. But it's been very challenging for each country to do that for different reasons. And we can talk about that. And we're seeing that play out in real time, right now in the United States with the challenge that the Biden administration is having with getting the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill through Congress. In particular, one thing that we see in the UK climate law that I think would be helpful for the United States and China is this idea of establishing emissions budgets for the country. And having an emissions budget, it's sort of like a financial budget where you say, we're only going to spend this amount of money. We're only going to emit this much over the course of a certain period of time. And then it imposes some discipline on how much spending you do, how much emissions you allow yourself to have. And because China works in a 5-year planning cycle anyway, it could be a very productive approach to Chinese climate policy. And likewise, in the United States, we tend to work on 4-year cycles because of our presidential election season. That it also could be a productive approach in the United States. But if countries cannot design, implement, and enforce climate policies today or in the near term, they will fall into what I recently called the net zero trap in an article I wrote in Foreign Affairs that's up on the website if you want to look at it. And the second challenge I wanted to identify is related to this trap. Namely that neither country has a very concrete plan for how they're going to achieve their mid-century targets, much less their near-term targets. So the United States has a target to reduce emissions 26 to 28% by 2005. That's just a few years from now. China's target is to peak its emissions before the year 2030. And in neither case do we have really comprehensive plan for how the countries will achieve these targets. The third big challenge is that the required socioeconomic transitions really haven't been confronted in either country. But these transitions are actually profound and will have to occur in a much more rapid timetable than we usually expect to see for technological change. So think about the very large number of coal miners in China. Where are all of those coal miners going to work? What is what is the job transition plan for those coal miners? Think of all of the state-owned enterprises at the provincial level and at the national level that are basically fossil fuel state-owned enterprises. If those state-owned enterprises go away, how will those provincial governments, how will those local governments, how will the central government replace them to get the revenue and also the employment that these state-owned enterprises provide? To give an example from the United States, very different, but in some ways similar, 20% of the funding for K through 12 education in the state of Texas comes from taxes and royalties assessed on oil and gas production. So that amounted to $6 billion in 2019. So you would need to replace that tax collection from the oil and gas industries to be able to run the public school system in the state of Texas. So this is what I mean about these complex socioeconomic transitions that I really feel like we still haven't taken seriously in either country. There's much more lip service to that in the United States than I think there is in China. But nonetheless, we really need to start getting serious about this. And in particular, thinking about the workforce needs. What are the workforce needs in a low carbon economy? How should colleges and universities be preparing students to enter a low carbon economy? What are the industries that students will be going into? What industries will they not be going into? And why are we still training people to go into older industries? What is the transition plan? It's not so easy for an iron and steel worker to just pick up and go work in a different industry. Over time, the long-term composition of the economy will have a lot of structural change. China has been working for many years to achieve a structural change in the composition of its economy, moving from heavy industry to lighter industry to a service-based economy. And you can see in China's choice of strategic emerging industries that it views greener, cleaner, low carbon industries as the industries of the future. So while I'd say China has forged far ahead of the United States in terms of establishing industrial policy to support the development of low carbon industries, it's done very little to think about how to transition workers in the legacy industries. And then my fourth big challenge, that both countries have to wrestle with in terms of climate mitigation is the business as usual will result in substantial stranded costs in each economy. And this reality points to rather substantial financial risk for both countries. United States has retired about 95 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants during the past decade. Most of those plants were at the end of their useful life, and they were done. So in replacing them, of course, there was this option to replace them with a new coal-fired power plant, but by and large, the United States has not done that. And the market kind of has been the principal driver of those decisions. Natural gas combined cycle power plants were cheaper, and more recently, even renewables have proven cheaper than natural gas in some parts of the country. But we find that in many other countries, and including China, and still today in China, the decision is to build new coal-fired power plants. And those coal-fired power plants will last easily for 30, 50, even 75 years. And that's a little bit discordant, right? Because we keep talking about needing to get to net zero by 2050. That's 29 years, right? So why would you be building new carbon intensive power plants that will last way past 29 years if we need to get to net zero by 2050? Now, admittedly, China's Xi Jinping announced that China would try to achieve net zero by 2060, but still that's only 39 years. So my point stands. Chinese climate policy is quite interesting. And in many respects, China has a quite comprehensive patchwork of policies that cover all major sectors. So while it hasn't passed a national climate change law, it has either passed laws or created regulations that cover all of the major emitting sectors. For the power sector, China originally used a feed-in tariff system, its feed-in tariff policy, to mobilize renewables. That system was replaced formally this year with a national emissions trading system, a cap and trade program for the power sector. It's far from perfect, but it's a start. Much more impressive were the results of China's feed-in tariff system, which did mobilize a massive investment in renewable energy. And China now has the largest renewable energy capacity of any country on Earth. In transportation, China's been very clear that it sees an end to internal combustion engines. It's even announced a date that it intends to phase out sales of internal combustion engines. It's strongly committed to high-speed rail, high-speed electric rail, and electric vehicles. So it has adopted a very clear vision and strategy for an electrified transportation future. And as China does over time replace coal with non-fossil energy, which is its strategy. In fact, China has a goal of achieving 20% non-fossil energy by 2030. Eventually, it will become a low-carbon strategy. And of course, China has provided massive subsidies and invested huge amounts of money in electric vehicle infrastructure. For buildings and the commercial sector, energy efficiency policies and green building standards have been the main approach. And emissions were slowing as a result of all of these policy measures. And in fact, many analysts believe that China had already peaked its emissions well ahead of 2030. And that led to a tremendous amount of pressure that we still see from Secretary Kerry or Special Envoy Kerry to try to induce China to move forward its peaking target, maybe to 2025. But as you may have seen in the news recently, China's restarted coal-fired power plant construction. And that's worrying because that will almost certainly cause Chinese emissions to increase. So just a word or two on cooperation, and then we can go to Q&A. When I worked in the Obama administration in 2013, 2014, and part of 2015, the US-China relationship was in such a different place than it is today. And you have to remember this was prior to the Paris Agreement. Most people thought it was an impossibility that the US and China would come together to have a climate change agreement. And when we started trying to negotiate that, I think it's fair to say that both sides kind of hoped it would be possible, but didn't, really expect it would actually happen. But I compare that period with today, and I see that there are many, many more irritants in the US-China relationship, ranging from national security, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity concerns, human rights and democracy concerns, economic and trade frictions, and of course, the disruption of the pandemic. And specific to climate change, much has happened in this intervening period because after all, the United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement after pushing countries very hard to join the Paris Agreement in 2015. And even though President Biden has rejoined, I think that there's really much less trust in China about whether the United States will honor its commitments. And to China's credit, even though President Trump withdrew, and China had every excuse to also withdraw after Trump did that, they stayed the course. But we also see United States being very concerned about China's new coal-fired power plant construction, and up until this fall, being very concerned about China's financing of high-carbon infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. And we know that Xi Jinping recently announced that China will stop building overseas coal plants. So that was a really important step in the right direction. So I'll stop here by saying it will be much harder for us to cooperate on climate change today on a bilateral basis. But nonetheless, I think cooperation is essential because these two countries remain the largest emitters, and they're looked to as the leaders of the global climate negotiations. I'm happy to talk more about, some potential avenues for cooperation if people would be interested, but of course that will be totally speculative. So let me stop here and see if there's questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. And it's interesting how you kind of walk through these United States and China, two countries that are so very different and yet face a lot of similar challenges in terms of addressing climate change, and maybe has, even as you were saying, similar tendencies to not really look squarely in the face what did you say, the complex socioeconomic challenges that face both countries. It's certainly very interesting. Well, we have a question that's come up in the chat, but I just want to use my position here to ask you one quick question. And it's kind of what you were just finishing off with there at the end, which is, as you're talking about, there are all these tensions now across the board in U.S.-China relations, very different atmosphere than it was, when you were working in the Obama administration. And yet, so this hostility is interfering with our ability to cooperate in the climate arena, right? And so, my question is what you basically were saying there at the end. We know we need to cooperate. We also know it's going to be tough to do so because there's a high level of mistrust. So, if you had Biden's ear or could talk to Xi Jinping or something, where would you recommend we focus our energies to cooperate in the climate arena? I mean, how can we do it in a way that acknowledges the challenges that exist outside the relationship?
Yeah, I have a few ideas. The first point, though, that needs to be made is that each of us acting individually can do a lot to inspire the other country. So if Biden does succeed in getting these two bills through Congress, and he can make this compelling case that the United States is about to make a once-in-a-lifetime investment in low-carbon infrastructure, right, and is going to be, however they solve the power sector policy problem, that right there puts pressure on China to kind of reciprocate and prove that they too are acting on climate, and vice versa. If China, and I think they've already done this, in a way they called our bluff. They established a national emissions trading system, which is still something that the United States hasn't managed to do, even though for years the United States pointed its finger at China and said, this is what you should do. You should do market-based mechanisms for, pollution control. Now China's built the largest, emissions trading system in the world. It does sort of put pressure on the United States to act. And I think also both countries have to be very cognizant of the fact that many other countries are looking to them to see, is it possible for you to reduce emissions? If you can do it, I can do it. Many developing countries look at China and they see the China development model, but the China development model is a very carbon intensive development model. So if China can show that there's a development model that's a low carbon development model, that would be very inspirational to other countries. Likewise, if the United States can do it, the Build Back Better, the Green New Deal, that sort of modeling, so to speak, I think could be inspirational. The main area I think that the US and China could work together, and almost must work together, is in greening development finance and development aid. Our two countries, and I would add Europe, I see no reason not to make this a trilateral sort of thing. And maybe, other advanced industrialized countries as well. We account for a huge proportion of overseas development finance, whether that's through the World Bank, institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, or China-led institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or New Development Bank, or directly through our bilateral our national institutions like the China Development Bank, China's Exim Bank, U.S. Development Finance Corporation, U.S. Exim Bank. And we have a tremendous responsibility to help developing countries begin this low carbon development trajectory. And a big concern I have is that what just happened over the last 30 years with China, where China went through this incredible, development, people have called it a miracle, right? This incredible explosion of economic growth. But the bad side of it was it also caused tremendous environmental damage and tremendous growth in greenhouse gas emissions. That same pattern will be replicated, with other developing countries, and which will make it impossible for us to get to net zero. So I think if the BRI could be channeled towards green development, if the United States overseas development institutions, development finance institutions, and aid agencies ideally could be working together, or at least, side by side, in this endeavor, it could make a big difference to the world.
Okay, so in that sense, the Xi Jinping's announcement that you mentioned, the announcement just last month that China's going to cease building overseas coal is a really important development, right? Because that gives a chance to, as you said, to have a green Belt and Road initiative where China, instead of building coal overseas, is now funding clean technologies, clean energy, that kind of thing.
I think that's right. And, China's public institutions, so-called policy banks, the China Development Bank, Exim Bank, they really had become the lenders of last resort in terms of public finance for coal. All the other major development banks, all the other bilateral financiers had stopped funding coal. Now that China's saying it too will stop using government funding to support overseas coal, the onus is now on both countries to make sure that their private sectors don't support overseas coal finance. In fact, there are a number of US institutions, BlackRock, Vanguard, other US banks that are still supporting overseas coal. And so all of this is to say, now that the government public funding, public support has been essentially choked off, both countries need to focus on regulating their private sector.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So let me just remind the audience that if you want to ask questions, you have two options. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, turn off, and then just ask your question directly, or you can put the question into the chat. I have a couple of other questions I can ask, but I should maybe turn to the audience. So let me turn to Will Cullen. Put a question in the chat. He said, thank you very much for your talk. And he asks, what are the prospects for restarting bilateral clean energy programs like the Clean Energy Research Center?
Well, I think those prospects are dim. They were very effective. That the CERC, as it was known, actually it's still in existence. And I think that people who don't know, this was basically the United States, the Department of Energy on the US side and the Ministry of Science and Technology on the Chinese side, both put in equal amounts of funding into a pool to do pre-commercial research development demonstration projects, I think in 5 areas. And I'm not going to remember all of them off the top of my head, but green buildings and carbon capture and storage and so forth. And one thing that was very notable was that the CERC had a common IP agreement that was negotiated by the two countries, so that intellectual property was protected. Any intellectual property that was developed was protected. And that agreement has worked. So there's a lot going for it. And I mean, really, I think it would be great if that sort of thing could be continued. But just speaking from, my sense of the political attitude towards China right now in the United States, in Washington, it's very hard to imagine the United States proposing to do new clean energy research with China. And I think vice versa, very hard to imagine the Chinese doing it. I mean, we're just, and technology, I think, is one of the most sensitive issues.
Yeah. And that's a view held on both sides of the aisle in Washington.
Yes. And I think that's another thing that has really changed in this intervening period, that the Democrats are as much or even more worried than the Republicans about, technology leakage to China, even, for technology that has public benefit.
Yeah, so it's a tough time. Okay, I see Isaac Brody has his hand up. So Isaac, you can go ahead and ask your question. I think you're muted, so you might need to unmute yourself before you do ask the question.
Okay. I think part of my question was already answered, but it was about the announcement Xi Jinping made about ceasing the coal-fired power plants abroad. So is there any actual legislation put into place to do this? Because as of now, it seems like, is it just an announcement? And then what kind of impact do you think this will have?
That's actually such a good question, because I have exactly the same question. When he made that announcement, my first reaction was, what does that mean? My first question, in fact, though the word he used, and I checked it in Chinese as well as English, was build. China will no longer build coal plants overseas. And in fact, Chinese contractors are usually one that build these plants overseas. So a very narrow interpretation of that announcement would be, I will no longer let Chinese contractors build these plants overseas, but we'll still finance them. So this question of whether or not China was going to finance these plants, actually, it still hasn't been resolved. Although the People's Bank of China followed up and made a separate announcement that they were going to stop all lending. Now, PBOC mostly lends inside China, domestically, not for overseas investments. So what I will be looking for, the policy that matters in terms of Chinese policy, is the industrial catalog that is published by the National Development and Reform Commission in China, which clarifies which industries are encouraged for finance, which industries are restricted for finance, and which industries are prohibited from receiving finance from Chinese banks. And there's a separate list for overseas investment compared with, what's allowed for domestic investment. And we did a paper on this a couple of years ago where we compared the two lists, and we saw which lists were restricted domestically. For example, coal mining investments was restricted domestically, but not restricted for overseas investments. So as soon as NDRC updates those lists, we'll really see, the actual policy implementation. That would be where we would see it. And by the way, there's another agency in China called SASEC, the State-Owned Assets and Supervision, and something. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is the agency that oversees all of the state-owned enterprises. And of course, many of them are very active in overseas investments as well, because they're huge corporations and they can self-finance a lot of their activities overseas. SASEC also has an industrial catalog with prohibited, encouraged, and restricted investments. That is not a public document. I've never seen it, but my assumption has always been that those lists are consistent with NDRC's industrial catalog lists. But your question about significance is, let's take the best interpretation, the most charitable interpretation, that and kind of the most expansive one, that China has said it will stop financing and building and supporting in every way, the construction of coal-fired power plants overseas. It is a big deal. China has been the lead public investor, really, for the last decade. Japan and Korea were also still financing coal plants until a couple of years ago, but the largest volume of public finance came from China. I would say coal plants is really just the first step. There are so many other carbon intensive investments that all the development banks are making. Think about most infrastructure investments. There's a lot of carbon intensity in cement, in steel, so when we think about what do developing countries need to develop, they need to build roads, they need to build bridges, they need to develop energy systems, build out electricity grids. And that can be a very carbon intensive process. And the technology choices that are made, with each of these infrastructure investments create, what we call in the academic literature, path dependence. Makes it very hard for those countries to shift to a new path. So that's why I was arguing that it's very important for us to start working together to think about how can we, shift all of this finance that's going into these developing countries towards greener, cleaner, lighter, lower carbon infrastructure.
Yes. Thank you, Isaac. That is a great question. And as Dr. Gallagher's response indicated, it's one that we're kind of all waiting to see what the answer is, right? But it's a really, really important question. Let me get to, there's one question that came up in the chat, and this is a Chinese name. I think it's Huashan, asked a question focusing on the United States, which is, what are the primary impediments to America going green, and what can the average citizen do?
Oh, that's a big question and a hard one. Well, I think our biggest impediment is our lack of political consensus about the urgency of the problem of climate change. We have, according to polling, 70 or 80% of Americans support, climate change policy and support action on climate change. But if you look at the positions of members of Congress, you don't see that kind of overwhelming support. You see much more division and separation, and especially in the Senate, as we're seeing, so vividly today, where you have 2 senators from each state, and that gives a lot of power. I mean, this is like American politics 101, but that was done on purpose, right? To give power to low population states, smaller states, and so they have equal representation in Congress. But even in the House, where of course the representation is based on population, we have seen actually the consensus about the need for action on climate to erode over time. I think many people forget the House actually passed climate legislation. It was the Waxman-Markey bill that passed out of the House and then failed to pass in the Senate in the run-up to the Copenhagen negotiations in 2009. It feels like another age. And that actually would have established an emissions trading system in the United States. So I think our lack of political consensus is really the essence of the problem. It's so clear what needs to be done. It's not like we don't have the policies. It's not like we don't have the technologies. It's actually not even that it will cost very much money. And that's why I was emphasizing so strongly that I think at the core is that we really haven't confronted the people who will suffer during this transition. And And we also really haven't confronted who will suffer from climate change itself, the vulnerable people. And I think probably those people don't understand how severe the consequences might be for them, and they don't know how to advocate for change. But you see some senators that are, I think, whose views are evolving as the impacts of climate change become more evident. And I think of someone like Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, a Republican, but he was one of the senators who engaged intensively in that bipartisan consensus on the infrastructure bill, precisely because he was so concerned about all the hurricanes that are hitting Louisiana. But Louisiana is sort of like the crux of the socioeconomic challenge, right? Because it's tremendously vulnerable to climate change itself, to sea level rise, to tropical storms. But it also has a huge oil and gas workforce. And so, I think the pressure feels acute to someone like Senator Cassidy. What's the appropriate way forward so he can protect those workers, but also try to limit climate change so that, his state doesn't disappear under the water over the next few decades.
Yeah. It's a great question. And as you said, it's a very tough one. So thank you, Huashan. Gabriella, I think you have your hand up. So if you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so my question kind of continues on from the conversation that you just started, but basically what is it gonna take for politicians and just government officials to actually take climate change seriously? Because for a large part, I see a lot of politicians pushing it off and not taking it as seriously as it should be. So my question is just, what will it take?
That's a hard question for me to answer because I'm not a politician, and I don't think it's in my DNA, because, to me, it's so self-evident that they have a responsibility to try to think about future generations. They have a responsibility as representatives to try to protect, the United States of America. And I think they don't understand it. Maybe they have some fear, that's a little bit paralyzing. And I think they also haven't learned to think about this as an opportunity. And here, actually, I think we can take some inspiration from China, because the Chinese saw, back around the turn of the century, and I've written a lot about this in previous books, that this global market was going to emerge in clean energy technology, and that that was a market that China could try to conquer. And so it built a world-class solar PV industry. It's built now a world-class electric vehicle industry, ultra-high voltage grid technology, and I could go on and on and on. And in fact, now China accounts for, I think, more than 80% of the global solar market. And they have all those jobs, right? They are the ones that have benefited so strongly from the energy transition to date. And I think if the United States stopped kind of being in a position of defensiveness and actually saw the low carbon transition as an economic opportunity, being mindful that it needs to take seriously the needs of those workers who are in existing high carbon industries, that kind of change in mindset that this is an opportunity, I think that could change the politics. There's an Indian parliamentarian that I've been in a dialogue with for a while, and he has this idea that net zero is net positive, and his theory, he introduced a new net zero bill into the Indian parliament, and his core idea is that green industrialization could be the way that India actually, finally achieves its development aspirations. So he has a very positive orientation, and believes it will be good, for India. And I think we need to have more of that mentality. I think President Biden was, trying to make that case in his idea of a Green New Deal and the Build Back Better paradigm. So I think the good news is, what a difference from 10 years ago. We have a president in the United States who actually really sees this as an opportunity and some, a transition that could be good for workers and good for the economy. But he's having a hard time convincing, even members of his own party.
Yeah, it's a tough environment. Thank you, Gabriella, for that question. Can I ask just a quick question? It's something that's come up a little bit, but so China right now has this energy crunch, right? Where something like 20 provinces across China are experiencing energy shortages. And I would just like to get your views on how you think that's going to impact how, the leaders in Beijing think about its energy profile and think about its actions to combat climate change going forward. Because on the one hand, that they could interpret it as, well, look, this is the dangers of relying on coal, and it could, and I'm thinking optimistically here, kind of hasten even more that desire to shift to renewable energies. But it's a form of energy insecurity. And of course, in the short term, it's going to mean more coal. And as you mentioned earlier, an increase of emissions. So I'm just, I'm curious as to how you think what you think the impact of this energy crunch might be.
Well, from what I can tell, the central government seems alarmed about these, energy shortages. So alarmed that, in fact, it's going to allow these coal-fired power plants to move forward. For the last 5-year plan, the central government was working assiduously to shut down, old, inefficient coal-fired power plants, and it was not permitting new coal-fired power plants to proceed. So the fact that they're now allowing, up to 200 new coal-fired power plants says to me that they are deeply concerned about, these electricity shortages, because the only reason why you would proceed with a coal-fired power plant in light of all the commitments you've made on coal is because you need power fast, and a new coal-fired power plant is cheap, easy, and very chunky, right? You get a big 500 megawatts new supply in one fell swoop, whereas otherwise you'd have to build, site and build 500 wind turbines, and that's perhaps a harder thing to do, though. If anyone could do it, it would be China, and they've already proven that they can do it. But I think they want these like big chunks of new power. But it also is a little retrograde. This feels very much like China in the 1990s. And whenever there was some sort of economic setback or some sort of recession, remember during the Asian financial crisis, the sort of default response was, okay, we're going to be counter-cyclical, we're going to be a little Keynesian in our approach, and we're going to invest in power infrastructure. And so they would start building coal-fired power plants. And of course, this also probably reflects that local governments are pushing very hard to restart and mobilize their industries. And to some extent, that's always been hard for the central government to control.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel a little less optimistic after your answer, but unfortunately that is probably the reality. I don't see any other hands up. If there aren't any other questions, I have just maybe one last question that we could finish with. And this is not, I wouldn't say this is a personal question, but it's perhaps slightly more personal. So, like you, I spend my time thinking about climate change and teaching on climate change. And, I find that kind of my own sense of optimism and my mood can swing a fair amount. There's times when I'm feeling, pretty worried about the direction in which we're going and the world that I'm going to be handing over to my children and my grandchildren. And then there's other times when I look at, for example, the rate at which the price of renewable energy has dropped, where I feel more optimistic. And one thing I've noticed when my environmental politics class is that sometimes I'm more optimistic than a lot of my students. I don't know if I saw a poll recently that said something, almost half of young Americans, that is Americans aged 16 to 25, agree with the statement that humanity is doomed due to climate change. And that makes me worried that there's a sense of fear that's leading to paralysis among young people who, I would like to think are all going to be out advocating for stronger policies in the United States. So my question is kind of, where are you? I mean, how do you feel when you look over the next couple of decades, which I mentioned at the beginning are so important? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel cautiously optimistic? Where's your own sense looking at all of this, the big picture?
Well, like you, I've had these swings, and because I was one of the people who helped to negotiate the U.S.-China climate agreement, and then the Paris Agreement, it was terribly dispiriting for me when the Trump administration withdrew the United States. And let me sort of explain why, because what I saw happen was that when the U.S. and China came together in their agreement in 2014, it initiated a virtuous cycle. Not only like between the United States and China, where we were trying to like outdo each other to show who is more progressive on climate, right? But it also just seemed to catalyze lots of other countries to come forward with their own targets and their own, I remember right after China made its commitment, Mexico said, well, we want to have a peaking target and we want to beat China, so I believe their peaking target was 2026. And, it just kind of kept snowballing from there. And I just felt like this virtuous cycle had kind of been initiated. And I was astonished by how rapidly that unfolded. And then, of course, culminating with the Paris Agreement, which really was our first universal, agreement where every country in the world made a pledge. Of course, the Paris Agreement was not nearly enough to solve climate change, but if everybody complied, with their commitments, it would have gotten us a long way, a huge reduction from business as usual. And then, of course, it was envisioned that there would be successors to the Paris Agreement over time. And that's part of what will be discussed in Glasgow next month. But we also saw how quickly it is to induce a vicious cycle, right? And I think that's what was so hard for me was Trump withdrew. And then right after that, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil was emboldened to say, I will not enforce my own climate change law in Brazil. He stopped enforcement of his own law. He stopped enforcing the forest code. And now, several years later, last year, we saw that the Amazon became a net source of greenhouse gas emissions for the first time ever. So like you, I think I veer from, despair to feeling very encouraged. I think that here's what I can say for sure. I know for sure we can do this. We can do this. We know which policies will work. I mean, we don't know exactly what combination and what sequence and all of that, but we know the broad policies that will work. We can see that countries that have tried have been very successful. The UK is a great example. UK has reduced its emissions 48% below 1990 levels. They've cut their emissions in half. And it's not like their economy has imploded or anything like that, right? So we know it's possible. And many European countries have made progress. So we've got the technology. We're going to keep investing in innovation. We'll have new and better technology for those sectors that are a little tougher for us right now. And really, I think what we need is the political will. And that really comes down to the people and how they vote and what they demand. And, you know, it remains to be seen if we've got the political will.
Yes, well, that's a great note on which to end. The witching hour is here, so I do think we have to wrap things up. But yeah, I really like the way you put it. You know, we've got the tools, we've got the technology, we've got the policy, the know-how, we've got examples, and we've just got to find the will, right? And that gets back to the earlier question about, you know, how do we green our own country, right? It's up to each of us to do his or her part. Well, again, I could continue this conversation for a long time, but I know you, me, Li Jin, we all have kids to get home to, families that are waiting for us. So I won't take up any more of your time, but I do thank you for joining us tonight and for this great conversation that I really enjoyed. And I hope all of you who are here in attendance enjoyed also. So we'll stop here, and I'll just say thank you to everyone and good night. And we'll hope to see you at next year's Chinatown Hall. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. I think Kelly just logged off.
I think we lost her. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to stay for 5 minutes. Can you?
Sure.
Philip?
Yeah. I have a moment.
All right.
I realized one of the disadvantages of doing this in my office is that they turn off the climate control in the office in the evening. Yeah, and it's about 150 degrees in my office right now.
My gosh.
Yeah. There's like no
So
air.
I thought, I see. Interesting. So I thought you have your office building also has, you don't have a classrooms in that building, right?
Now nursing has taken it over.
Oh, okay.
There's no classrooms on our floor anymore.
Okay.
Yeah,
I see.
It's political science and nursing on this floor. Kind of an odd combination.
I thought you also have the geography. You used to have a geography there, right?
They're up on the 4th floor, like sharing an office with the dean.
Okay,
So.
I see. All right, I'm going to kick off the other people who are still here because we're done with this event. For those who are still here, please log off. We wish you a good night, and I will see you at next year's event.
Yep. Thanks.
Always, are you there? We see some familiar faces, like names there. Okay, I think people probably they left, but they just left their computer on. I can remove people now. Okay, remove people.
Yeah, let's see. I think I can do this too. Okay. Is that everybody?
Yeah, I think so. Right. I think went very well. People logging, and that one person who registered for an event as a friend. But anyway, so he probably, I don't know why, he just left one sentence and then left. That's it.
That
You're
one
weird.
There?
Yeah. Okay. I see the registration. This person was registered, and he is not just someone randomly came into our room. So yeah, how do you feel? Do you feel this is a
Yeah.